Hello everyone. In this week's lab, synthesis of aspirin, you will be required to calculate theoretical yield and percentage yield. This video will explain the calculations for theoretical yield. Aspirin is synthesized according to this reaction. We start with salicylic acid. It reacts with acidic anhydride. And the resulting product is acetyl salicylic acid, which is also known as aspirin. If you calculate the molecular mass of salicylic acid, will come out to be 138.12 grams over mole. This is the molecular mass of salicylic acid. On the other hand, molar mass of aspirin or acetyl salicylic acid is 180.16 grams over mole. If we look at the equation is balanced. Therefore, the coefficient in front of salicylic acid is 1 and coefficient in front of acetyl salicylic acid is 1. So therefore, from the balance equation, 1 mole of salicylic acid is equals to 1 mole of aspirin. Also, from the molecular weight, we can say that 1 mole of, from now on I'll call salicylic acid SA and I'll call aspirin ASP. 1 mole of salicylic acid is equals to 138.12 grams. So these are all mole calculations and we are already aware of this one. Similarly, we can calculate the mole relationship for aspirin. 1 mole of aspirin is equals to 180.16 grams of aspirin. For calculation of theoretical yield, we only need to know these three relationships. How we calculate the theoretical yield? So we're gonna start with this relationship. So we start with grams of salicylic acid and we're gonna convert grams of salicylic acid to moles of salicylic acid. And then from moles of salicylic acid we'll go to mole of aspirin, and then moles of aspirin will go to grams of aspirin, and whatever we get here, this is the theoretical yield. Okay. So how do we go from grams of salicylic acid to moles? We're gonna need a conversion factor, and that conversion, let's call this conversion factor 1, and this conversion factor 1 will come from the relationship between grams and moles of salicylic acid, and that is given here. Similarly, to go from moles of salicylic acid to moles of aspirin, we're gonna need another conversion factor, and that conversion factor, we know it here. And the final, we're gonna need another conversion factor, which is between moles of aspirin to grams of aspirin, and that conversion factor can be obtained from this equation. So let's plug in the conversion factors, and we should be able to get our answer. Now, because I'm not gonna solve exactly your calculation, so I'm gonna assume my salicylic acid given grams in the beginning. In your case, you will have your starting value of salicylic acid. You should use your starting value. So in my case, so I'm gonna start with, so given value of salicylic acid. So salicylic acid used, I'm gonna assume that I started with 1.5 grams of salicylic acid. In your case, you may have started in with something else, so you use your value. So if we conduct this reaction with 1.5 grams of salicylic acid, let's see how much will be my theoretical yield. So I'm gonna plug in the salicylic acid value here. So I will have 1.5 grams of salicylic acid multiplied by conversion factor 1, which is number 2 equation. So down here will be 138.12 grams, and up here will be 1 mole salicylic acid multiplied by, next is conversion factor 2, which is moles to mole conversion. So 1 mole salicylic acid, up here will be 1 mole aspirin multiplied by, last one is moles of aspirin to grams of aspirin. So down here will be 1 mole aspirin, up here will be grams of aspirin, which is 180.16 grams of aspirin. So grams aspirin cancels with this, grams of aspirin, salicylic acid, moles of salicylic acid cancels with moles of salicylic acid, moles of aspirin cancel with moles of aspirin, and we have at the end okay. So we got 270.24 divided by 138.12 grams of aspirin. and the answer comes out to be 1.96 grams of aspirin. So this is my theoretical yield. So theoretically, starting with 1.5 grams of salicylic acid, you should be able to get 1.96 grams of aspirin. Experimentally, you may have obtained something else. So experimental yield is whatever you get in experimentally. Let's say we got X grams of aspirin at the end of the experiment. Whatever we actually get in at the end of the experiment, that's experimental yield. And percentage yield is experimental yield divided by theoretical yield multiplied by 100. Okay, so plug in your values and you should be able to calculate the percentage yield.